Right, this week we want to talk about modern horror, and this is in comparison to what we watched last week. Um, Bride of Frankenstein was an example of gothic horror. Now, how is modern horror different? Modern horror films are more likely to be set in the modern world, less likely to be set in an old crumbly castle. That's a dead giveaway. And more importantly, they deal with modern moral problems, modern moral ambiguity. And when I say ambiguity, what's the difference between right and wrong, and does good necessarily have to triumph over evil? And this is something that's very common in modern horror films. And so if you end up having a not so happy ending or an ambiguous ending, then you know you're probably watching a modern horror or an offshoot of that. Also, we have use of previously taboo subjects, which is always good and fun in a horror film. So things like incest, matricide, necrophilia, cannibalism. We also get progressively more violence, gore, and sexuality in these films. So essentially, the things that most of you viewers are used to seeing in horror films, those are what you end up seeing in modern horror films and from now on. And those taboo subjects and the gore, the violence, and sexuality, those are a lot of the things we associate with horror films. The earlier gothic horror films, they seem awful tame to us because they don't actually have that. So, examples of modern horror, and pay close attention to the dates here. Psycho from 1960. 1960 was a long time ago. That was 50 years ago, and that was still, considered, the birth of modern horror, so to speak. Peeping Tom, which was kind of the British version of Psycho in a lot of ways. Repulsion, the Roman Polanski film from 1965. Night of the Living Dead from 1968, and Rosemary's Baby from 1968. These are all good examples of modern horror. And modernity, or the modern age, essentially kind of continued up until about 1990 or so, which is when we moved into the postmodern era. But we'll talk about more of that later on in the class. So there's no real clear beginning to modern horror films. There were still a lot of late 50s and early 60s horror films that were still gothic horror films, remakes of those by British Hammer Studios, which were basically bloodier versions of Frankenstein and Dracula. And then also low-budget splatter films, which are modern in some ways, not so modern in others, but they're kind of really hard to talk about in a theoretical context because they're so terrible. But we'll talk about that next week when we actually watch one of those. Now, the film we're going to watch this week is a zombie film, so we want to talk about zombies, and in particular, Romero zombies, because when you folks think about zombie films, most of the rules you have that go along with it come from the George A. Romero zombies. Although, actually, in more recent times, we've actually started making them do some things that the Romero zombies never would. But that's kind of an aside. So, zombies have been around for a long time. Since as early as the 1920s. So we talked about The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari being one of those German expressionist films that we've got a sleepwalker who's basically a zombie. Also, I Walked with a Zombie, White Zombie, and some of those other films. But it's really the Romero films that codified the zombie behavior and what we tend to think of as being the rules of the zombie subgenre. What are some of those rules? Well, aim for the head, and a lot of the other things you'll actually learn in the film we watched today. Another thing that's really important about zombie films, and the Romero zombies in particular, is they resonate with the wider social events and the things going on in the world in the late 1960s, which is what we have with Night of the Living Dead. So definitely Vietnam commentary there. The mid-1970s with Dawn of the Dead. They're in a shopping mall, so there's definitely commentary on consumerism. And early 80s with the movie Day of the Dead, which has to do with the industrial military complex. We've got this idea of political accountability, trying to take the zombies and turn them into weapons. Now, unfortunately, later on, the Romero zombies don't resonate quite as well, but, everything has its day.